some devotional thoughts. We've given him a little bit more time than what is normal on Wednesday night, so he'll take 10 or 15 minutes. So that'll be the next 2 Wednesdays. So I'm going to try. That's right, the Wednesday before New Year's, and then of course the first Wednesday after the New Year, 2021. It's almost here. We'll pick back up in this class. Glad everybody's here tonight. Glad for those who are visiting with us. We're especially thankful that you're here with us tonight. If this is your first time in this class since we started the ministry of Christ, that's all right because we haven't gotten to the ministry of Christ yet, but we're working our way up there. And I promise, well, let me backtrack a little bit. I hope that you'll see the benefit of covering this history when we go into the life of Christ. And I think that you've probably already been seeing that. I've tried to give you scripture each time so you can kind of see the parallel of, why we're talking about the things that we're talking about in this introduction. And so there is a new handout sheet back in the back, a worksheet, a lot of questions to fill in. So if you did not get one of those, you might want to just go ahead and get one now. Does anybody need one? We've got great people here that'll be glad to get up and hand you. Does anybody need one? Yep, it says worksheet 2 at the top. Because I think it will be good if you write some of these things down. I'm trying to get it. If you hear something, they say you remember it so much. And then if you write it down, you remember it so much more. And if you see it also, they say that ups it. So we're going to try to do all 3 when it comes to this. Because I know a lot of this can be a little bit complicated. But when it comes to studying the life of Christ and the Bible in general, it's good to remember the land. Know the land. This is what we talked about last week, so we won't go any more into that, except, let me give you an example. When you go from Jerusalem or Israel into Samaria, it might be an invisible line, but a lot of things change once you cross that line. So know the land. We'll talk a little bit about Bible geography, but this will not be a Bible geography class. And then we talked about, remember last week, knowing the history. Some of the things that take place, it's important for us to know. And remember we used the example, if I told you I was a graduate of Harvard University, well that would probably impress you and make you think, well, he must be pretty sharp in order to even get into that school. And then we combined that with, remember who Paul studied under? Gamaliel. Back then, that would have been impressive. That would have been impressive. If I would have told you I studied at his feet, if we were in the first century, that would have been impressive because he was world renowned. And then we talked about Matthew and Simon the Zealot. What was Matthew? What did he do for a living? He was a tax collector. And since we know the history, who was the ruler of the land, including Israel or Palestine during that time? Rome was. And so who was Matthew collecting taxes for? Yeah, Rome. All right, and what was Simon? Some places he's called a Canaanite, another place he's called a zealot. What were the zealots? They were a group against what? Against Rome. They didn't want Rome intrusion. They were the Jews who wanted to keep things the way they were and get back to their roots and all of these things. And so you had Matthew, a tax collector, and a zealot who would have hated a tax collector collecting taxes for Rome, a Jewish citizen collecting taxes for Rome. That's right, and they were both apostles. And remember we read the quote that Tom had in his book, and he quoted Barclay on this. If Simon the Zealot had met Matthew the tax collector anywhere else than in the company of Jesus, he would have stuck him with a dagger. And there's probably a lot of truth in that. That's not an exaggeration. And then, so we know the land, we know the history, and we'll try to be bringing these things out where it's needed as we study the Bible, the ministry of Christ. And then, knowing the culture is the third one from last week that we did not have time to get to. Knowing the culture. If you think about it, every society lives its life with predictable reflexes and rituals. We all do. Every society, doesn't matter where you are, each society is going to have its own way of living. Its own way of living. For example, your social habits, religious traditions, political interests, music, art, they contribute to the values shared not just by us, but for generations. You are who you are today. And sometimes I don't know that we think about this enough. Really, you are who you are today, first of all, because of your choice. You can overcome these things. But you know, a lot of who we are goes back generations. It shapes us into who we are. You know, our grandparents, the way they raised their children, who raised you, and so on and so forth. And so there is a connection there. But we don't really think about this. We all just realize we are who we are. And even those of us who may have been raised differently or reared differently by different parents, there's an overall American culture that we all just understand because this is where we live. This is where we live. And so we don't really need to define our culture very often because we just basically inherit it. It's just the world in which we live. But, and I can speak from experience on this, you go to another country, you'll spend half of your time just trying to figure out what's going on. And those of you who have traveled abroad, you know this is the case, especially in a third world country. You'll spend half of your time just trying to figure out what's going on. Those of you who may have served in the armed forces, when you would go into and take leave, you'd go into some of these other places, you should see some strange things. But here's the difference. Here's the thing. It's not strange to them. Who's the strange one when you go over to India? You are. You're the strange one. And so it's important to think about that. And it's no different when we go back and we study the culture of the New Testament especially. Let me give you a couple for instances. Men, if you were here in our culture and you saw a woman carrying a 5-gallon bucket of water, men, what would you naturally do? Stay out of the way? All right. Any other man, what would you do? Try to help them. That's just what you would do, isn't it? What about if they were carrying a big bundle of wood? I mean, a huge bundle of wood, and she put it on top of her head, and she carried it, and it's heavy. And she was carrying it way for a couple miles all the way back to the house. What would you try to do, men? All right. And women, what would you do if there was 2 5-gallon buckets of water that needed to be taken in, just from a mile back to the house? What would you do? Call your husband. That's exactly right. And he wouldn't complain about it. Well, shouldn't complain about it because he would realize that's his job. That's his job. Now, the first few times we were in Africa, in Tanzania specifically, I would see a woman carrying heavy buckets of water on her head, and huge. And when I say firewood, I'm not talking about little cut-up things. I mean, they might be like half of a tree, and she's carrying this on her head. And of course, I go out there, try to help her. I noticed some people laughing at first, but then finally, one of them said to me, "Don't do that anymore. That's woman's work." And that's how they view it. That's the woman's work. And you see, that's how odd it is to us. Christopher Makabanji, some of you remember him. He's a great, great, great man. And those of you who remember him when he went through school, you'll know that to be the case. Well, he's a Tanzanian, as you could probably tell by the name, Makabanji. But over there, one of the funniest things that I've ever been a part of was there, you don't tell your wife that she's beautiful, and you don't tell her you love her. And I was trying to tell him, I said, "Christopher, you got it all backwards. If you tell them, that you love them, how beautiful they look, they'll pay you back, and it'll work to your advantage. Just trust me on that." And he said, No. I said, "Do it." I said, "Next time," Julia is his wife, "next time she comes in here, just tell her how beautiful she looks today. And so she walks through. I said, there she is, Chris. Go for it. Go for it. And so he says in Swahili, I didn't understand it all, but I understood the middle part of the sentence where he says the name Mark. I said, what did you just say? He said, I told her Mark wanted me to tell her she's beautiful. So I asked them, and that, to me, that's just strange. Because my culture, you build your wife up, you build your adult, And he says their thinking is, if you tell her that too much, she'll think she can do better than you, and she'll go off with someone else. Which makes a little sense. Makes a little sense. But my point is this, the culture. Let me tell you one more story. This is not story time, but just to give us an understanding of why I think this one is so important. I did not know, I don't know what I was thinking. If Mindy would have been there, she would have filled me in, but she wasn't on this particular trip. My first time to India, the Gudams made me crab curry, which is my favorite Indian dish by far, crab curry. By the time you're done, you've got just curry all over your arms because you eat it with your hands, and it's just delicious. Well, all the men were sitting down, and the women kept on serving us, and kept on serving us, and kept on serving us. And they kept on putting that, there's not a whole lot of meat on a crab, so you can eat a lot of those rascals before you get full. And I did. And then I found out that the women eat after the men. And I had eaten all the crab. So they didn't get any of that. And so it took me a while to figure that out. Well, it took me one time to figure that out. You talk about feeling like a heel, because it's expensive over there. And it's just a different culture. The women don't eat until the men are done, usually when there's guests. And so these different cultures. And my point is this. If we try to apply our culture to some of the New Testament, we're going to miss some important things in the ministry of Christ. Let me give you a couple examples for this. When we look at some particular New Testament passage, we'll ask questions about the culture, and then we'll answer them. We'll try to answer them. And it leads to a much deeper understanding. Don't answer these now, because you probably know the answer to some of these, if not all of them. When a young son asks his father for his inheritance early, what would be the expected response? If I did that to my dad, that would have hurt him so badly, wouldn't it? I wouldn't do that. Nobody in here would. What would the older brother think? You know which parable, which account I'm talking about. What about this? Why was the woman at the well collecting water at that time of day? Why was she, a female, number one, collecting water, carrying those heavy buckets? Why was she doing it? Why was she doing it at the time of day that she was doing it? And why was she shocked when Jesus spoke to her? There's some culture. Now, in that one right there, you've got where the land is important. She was a Samaritan. You've got where the history is important. Why did the Samaritans hate the Jews and the Jews hate the Samaritans? And we also see something about culture, all three, in that one account. And when we understand that just a little bit more, you talk about a deeper meaning of that whole account. And we'll talk about those when we get to them. So the point I want to make from this, we can't allow our cultural assumptions cause us to miss certain things. All right. As I said last week, let me say it again. You do not need to know culture, history, or Bible geography to get to heaven. You don't. However, just knowing one small detail will lead to something bigger, to something bigger, to something bigger, to where you get a grasp of the text and the situation in a way that you never knew possible, just by digging just a little bit. So that's what we're going to do. All right. Let's go on now. That was all from last week. Let's go ahead and talk about some history. And again, don't get scared. We're going to get into it here before long. A lot of this information came from a man by the name of Craig Blomberg. It's called Jesus and the Gospels, an introduction and a survey. And some really good information in this. We're going to talk a little bit more about the intertestamental period. And we talked a little bit about this on Sunday for our worship. But there were some political developments in Israel during the centuries that led up to the life and ministry of Jesus that just had huge impacts on what Jesus was able to do, what the apostles were able to do, what the church was able to do in the book of Acts. And again, like I was saying earlier, you are who you are today because you were shaped by generations. And all of this shapes the true growth of the church. It just leaves it in perfect hands for the church to do exactly what it did. Let me just give you some sources here, and you might want to jot these down if you're interested in this. These are secular sources, so keep that in mind. But if you want to know some of the ancient sources, you have Josephus. You've probably heard of him. But during the centuries leading up to and including the life of Christ is Josephus's Jewish Antiquities. It's a 20-volume work of the history of the Jews. And there's a lot of interesting reading on that. For the decades immediately after Christ, Josephus's Jewish War is useful. And Josephus, a little bit about him, we won't talk about him much, but just to give you kind of an idea of who he is, he lived about 37 to 100 AD, and he described himself as one time a Pharisee, and he was a military general, he says, in the war against Rome. He became a loyal supporter of Rome and wrote much under the patronage of Rome. And so you will see some Rome leanings in there. And it doesn't surprise you because, please who you pay, or who's paying you. Although he clearly wrote with a pro-Roman bias, he may be regarded as a relatively accurate historian, relatively. There's some exaggeration in some of his writings, I'm sure. And then you have the Apocrypha. You've probably heard that word before. It's hidden. The Catholics consider this to be inspired, but it is not. Those are some during the intertestamental period. That's the history of that. It's some interesting reading because a lot of it does tell you the history, but there's some far-fetched stories, and the hero is played on there. It reads more like a superhero movie than what the Bible does. And then you have the pseudepigrapha, which is false inscriptions. That's what that means. And there's more than 60 additional works in that. But all of those history books, ancient history books, tell you about this period of 400 years before Christ came. Now, here's what we're going to answer, and this is where it starts to get important. Why is this so important? Why is this so important? Why is this era, the 400 years before Christ came, why is it so important to understanding the gospel accounts in a deeper way? Well, first of all, you had some key developments, both political and socioeconomically. These key developments took place that we're going to trace and see for the next 2 sessions, probably it will take us. Number 2, it's important to understand, to interpret the situation of the Jews at the time of Jesus. Why did they feel the way that they did? Why did they think the way they did? Why did they feel the way they did? Why were they so discouraged when Jesus wouldn't become the king? There's a question right there. What were they hoping to get from Jesus, and why did they turn on him so quickly when he didn't give them what they wanted from him? Religiously, Judaism was transformed into a set of beliefs and practices that were very different in a lot of ways from the Old Testament practices. Yeah, and that's what we're going to show in this. That's a great point. But here it is. If you want to see the hand of the providence of God in history, then look at these events that paved the way to Christ. And this, I may be alone on this, but I doubt that I am. This is exciting for me to see what God was doing to prepare for Christ. Why was he silent? Was he really silent? Was he still active? And that phrase and that verse, but when the fullness of time had come, the perfect time, the perfect place, the perfect situation, the Lord came. And we're going to see that in these next. So let's go all the way back to 434 BC. The Persian Empire. Remember, after Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, the Persian Empire. After Artaxerxes died, little changed for the Jews. They continued much the same as they had during the time of Nehemiah, Haggai, and Malachi. The Persian rulers continued with the decree of Cyrus in 539. They allowed the Jews to return to their homeland. Remember, Nehemiah had permission to go back and build the wall. They were able to return back to their homeland. They were able, for the most part, to worship freely. And they were even allowed to obey the law of Moses when the Persians were in rule. Now, and this kind of talks about what Miss June was saying. Their attitude towards the law during this time became more reverent. Do you remember when Ezra brought the book of the law? He had prepared his heart. And you remember the response of the people? All that the Lord says, we will do. There was a renewed zest and zeal for keeping the law. And we're going to see what they did with that. They became really more reverent for it in many ways because they were convinced, and rightly so, that their exile was because they weren't being faithful to God. And so there was a turn in that, as we'll see. They started, in many ways, to look for complete freedom by strictly following and obeying the law of Moses. Now, 3 important new developments from this. Here's the Persian Empire. Goes all the way over here. Right up here is Jerusalem and Israel, Palestine. And look how far it went, all the way over to India. That's a pretty big territory, isn't it? We're going to see what happens with that. But let's look at 3 important developments during the Persian period. Now, you're going to be able to jump to conclusions, and you'll be able to see this, I think, as soon as I bring these things out. And some of you might already know some of these things. But, first of all, was the rise of the synagogue. Without access to the temple, making pilgrimages to the temple, and those who lived there did so oftentimes daily. Without access to the temple in which to gather and offer their sacrifices, the Jews began to congregate in local places. Smaller groups, smaller gatherings would come together, and they would read the book of the law, and the rabbi might give some instructions from there as well. They drew on passages from like 1 Samuel 15:22, to obey is better than sacrifice. What are we going to do? We can't go to the temple to sacrifice. These are the kind of things that they started to do. Look at Acts chapter 13, verse 15. And you tell me, Acts 13, verse 15. Let me just read this really quickly. Acts 13, verse 15. And after the reading of the law and the prophets, the rulers of the synagogue sent to them, saying, Men and brethren, if you have any word of exhortation for the people, say on. Where did Paul, when there was a synagogue available in that city, where did he go? He went to the synagogue. Now imagine if Paul goes to the synagogue and the one who is presiding over the service welcomes Paul in and says, hey, if you have anything to say, why don't you come up and say something? What do you think Paul's going to do? That's saying sick him to a dog, isn't it? He's going to get up there, he's going to say something, isn't he? And so every time when there was a synagogue, where would they go to first? They would go to the synagogue. Well, that's where the religious people were. And he would preach Jesus to them, and he would use their very own law, the Old Testament, to prove that Jesus was the Christ. So how was that beneficial? And then you think about this. When the church would come, 400 years later after the Persians, how do we meet? Little groups. Some bigger than others, but little groups. We come together. setting the stage for something we might just take for granted today. Number two in this, you had a rise in the body of oral tradition. Oral tradition. Because they sought to apply the Torah to every area of their life, that's the law, interpretation and application, they began to develop this oral tradition around the law of Moses. So when he talks about fasting, how often should I fast? What should I do? And they began to develop this system of oral tradition. Have you noticed sometimes when Jesus said, you have heard it said that so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so. So wait a second. Was that part of the old law? Well, it became part of their oral tradition, which became law to them. To go against the oral tradition was a very serious thing. Do you remember when he was talking about how often some people were bragging about fasting? They would go in oral tradition. Matter of fact, in many ways, it became more strict than the law, believe it or not. And they would try to apply that to everybody. They desired to explain how to implement its commandments in new times and new places. And so both the synagogue and the oral law were of great importance in Jesus' interaction with Judaism later on. And then number three, with the Persians, the establishment of the Aramaic language as the main language for business and international relations throughout many parts of the Persian Empire. So when you have, let me go back to the map, you have all of this being under one people. You think about how many different languages are spoken there. Well, you try to get one language. How's that going to help with spreading the gospel? We're going to see more on that. So those three things during the Persian area, the rise of the synagogue, a body of oral tradition, and the establishment of the Aramaic. And then secondly, we'll see how quickly we can start with this. After them, Alexander the Great and the Hellenistic period from 331 to 167. You've probably heard of him. This was the first major new era of Middle Eastern history after the end of the Old Testament began with the defeat of the Persians by the Greeks. Listen to this about Alexander's daddy. The defeat of Athens by Philip II of Macedon in 338. And that was just the start of what he did. Listen to what he did. Isocrates said to him, in capturing some of this area, Isocrates, not Socrates, but Isocrates said this about him. Once you have made the Persians subject to your rule, there is nothing left for you but to become a god. Kind of how they were thinking about him. He was assassinated 2 years later. Yeah, Philip the Macedon. Yeah, Philip of Macedon, who was assassinated 2 years later. But his son Alexander took up where his dad left off and did more than his dad really ever even imagined. Let me tell you a little bit about Alexander the Great. I want you to see again this area. This is what he ruled. This is what he conquered. All the way over, a little bit farther than the Persians, as we're going to see. Egypt down here. Let's look at him a little bit. He was born in 356 BC. He was taught by Aristotle, and he was inspired, so the history books tell us, by Achilles. Does anybody know who Achilles was? Go back to your college classes or your high school classes. They made you read this book. Yeah, Tom said he had the big heel. He was the warrior in the Iliad. Remember that old book, ancient literature? He was the warrior in the Iliad. And so Alexander looked at him and said, hey, that's what I want to be when I grow up. He is considered by many to be the greatest, or at least one of the greatest military leaders of all time. And that map showed it, if that's what you're into. That's right. In 13 years, from 336 to 323, he conquered and controlled virtually all of the former Persian Empire, plus some of the other territories. 13 years. this is what he did. He had it all conquered by that time. And then his rule extended all the way from Greece to India and from southern Russia to northern Africa. Now think about that. 13 years, this is what he did. Yeah, that's right. He wasn't driving a Hummer, was he? Or a tank. Here's something else that I think is interesting. He came into rule in 331 BC, or Israel came under the Greek rule in 331 BC. And like most people that were conquered, the Jews were given the same relative freedoms of worship, just like under the Persians. Not a whole lot changed in government as under the Persians, as long as they remained loyal subjects to Greece. But this is where it gets interesting. Alexander, the second point that you see up there, he hoped to unite the eastern and western parts of his empire to create a new hybrid of cultures. His goal was to, all right, let's kind of create a new culture by just combining all of these cultures together to one new culture, religions, peoples, and permeate. And one of the ways you want to do this, and this is important, he wanted to have a Hellenistic culture and influence. That word Hellenistic comes from Hellas, the Greek word for Greece. So he wanted it to be a Greek influence over all of the world. Now, have you ever read Hellenists in your New Testament? The widows. All right, that's good. We're going to leave that right there. That's exactly right. And then we're going to look at that a little bit later. Why was there a problem? Why would the... Okay, that's right. And we'll see that there might be a little bit more to that, and this will help us with that. So, the voluntary dispersion of many of the Jews continued as under Persia. The Jews, since this was all like one big land, they were able to go where they wanted to go. And they did what a lot of people do. They chased the dollar. They chased the shekel, or whatever the Greek money was at that time. They went where the money was. And so you had the Jews spreading to other parts of the world. Might that be something important? I'll talk about that as well. Separating to other parts of the world. As a matter of fact, and I think I had this up here, the largest Jewish community outside of Palestine developed in Alexandria of Egypt. And this would become a very important place for Christians by the end of the 2nd century too. You hear some things about Alexandria. Here's some important developments, and this will be on your answer sheet for this. By Alexander's conquests, as they lasted well until Rome came. But number one, the Greek rule brought improved standards of living and administrative efficiency. I opened the doors. We better stop right there. But let me just say this point, because I was excited to get to this. That shift facilitated mass communications so that news could spread very quickly. And they focused on key cities in different places where people would go in and out, bigger cities where people would go in and out, so news could spread fast. And the Greeks invented this. It was kind of like the internet before there was the internet. Now, how might that be beneficial to the spread of the gospel? We'll talk about that. And I hate that we have to wait 2 weeks to do it. We'll start with Alexander. We're almost done with the history part. We'll spend more time when we get to what Rome did. But we're going to bring all of this together next time that we meet together.